I am Seema Kumar, and I'm the CEO of Cure. Today, we'll discuss a topic that is important and top of mind in healthcare. That's clinical trials and the challenges surrounding patient access and recruitment. We'll also explore how pharmaceutical companies are placing an increased focus on diversity and inclusion in clinical trials with a goal to recruit individuals from different backgrounds, genders, and disabilities. Clinical trials are an essential part of the process for testing, developing, and submitting to the FDA for approval new indications of drugs and brand new treatments and cures for diseases and conditions. However, if you are a patient who's been diagnosed with a condition and are trying to find information about enrolling in a trial, well, good luck making sense of the vast and complex and sometimes confusing array of information that exists on trials. My guests today are the founders of the Clinical Trial Guide, a comprehensive clinical trial user guide that is helping patients and their families navigate the clinical trial process. David Polinsky is the founder of Clinical Trials Guide, an entrepreneur who spent more than 20 years in pharma and created the Clinical Trial Guide to help educate patients seeking information that's not otherwise readily available to all. And Rivka Shafransky is the CEO and lead patient advocate of Clinical Trials Guide, where she oversees the day-to-day operations and strives to create a better world by building resources for patients and their families. Thank you, David, and thank you, Rivka, for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us
here
today.
we are on the rooftop of Cure. I'm really, looking forward to having a wonderful chat with you about clinical trials, a very important topic. So we'll dive right in. Tell us a little bit more about this content hub that you both created and how it's helping patients find the clinical trials information about, what pharmaceutical companies are doing in terms of recruiting patients for certain types of conditions.
Sure. Thank you, Seema. Appreciate it. Beautiful space. Happy to be here today.
Thank you.
We really thought about the guide over the course of the last few years to provide a resource to patients that is surprisingly really otherwise not available. The only resource right now really available to patients to learn about trials is a government-run website called clinicaltrials.gov, which is really industry-focused. And we set out, based upon just need and for patients, to learn about trials in a plain English manner to develop Clinical Trial Guide. Over the course of 20 years in the industry, as most people in the industry receive countless calls from patients seeking trials, very often for potentially life-saving trials, but they don't know how to go about finding the information that they need. And so we set out to provide this information in order to really win-win-win, help patients who are seeking information about trials, help pharmaceutical companies who are enrolling for their trials, and ultimately help society, because the faster drugs could get developed, the faster these drugs could get to patients who would otherwise not have the availability to get the drug or the treatment or potentially life-saving treatment.
Yeah, let's face it. Clinicaltrials.gov is actually a great resource, right? Because it is sort of the centralized place where all the information about all trials exist. However, if you are somebody who's a lay person, it is very scientific and it's got a lot of technical details. So making sense of that information is really, not something that you as a lay person can do, right? It's more geared towards somebody who's, a physician or somebody who's in the medical industry. Is that right?
Correct. It's absolutely much more industry focused. It's a requirement companies to post the information about the trials, and it's a very comprehensive resource. However, if you think about multiple other industries out there, if you think about finance, there's a whole plethora of websites that will provide financial information, CNBC and all these other websites. If you think about sports, if you think about even, diseases, you'll find information on all sorts of Healthline and other sites. But when it comes to trying to find a clinical trial, there really isn't that information that's tailored and customized to the potential patient who wants to find the information on their own, who wants to research potential trials out there in a plain English manner, in a simple to understand means. Rivka, do you want to add?
I like to say that what we created is like the WebMD, of clinical trials. So in the same way that if a person's, arm hurts them or leg hurts them, the first place they're going to go is, to Google. They're going to be putting in what's bothering them, and then they're going to end up on WebMD, Healthline, Mayo Clinic, anything like that to get the information. But if a patient goes to a physician and their physician says to them, the treatment options that are out there are really not going to help you right now, you should consider a clinical trial, the first place they're going to go is they're going to Google it. And the goal is that they should end up on our site and get all that basic information that they need. Because as the world stands today, the average person on the street has heard the term clinical trial, especially post-COVID. We all know what that means, but we don't really understand it. And this gives patients and the average person the ability to understand the process and know what's involved and have the resources that they need to see if that's the right treatment option for them.
Yeah, and this is even more important because, at least when I started in this industry a long time ago, there were, few enough clinical trials going on that you could navigate through it. But just over the past couple of decades, clinical trials have grown exponentially, right? And then we're now doing larger and larger clinical trials, like the cohorts are massive, right? And so in 2000, there were 4,000 clinical trials being done and being recruited for just in the United States. And just in the last year, in 2022, more than 134,000 were published, with 50% of the trials targeting some form of cancer. So that's a lot of information to sift through, right? Yeah. So give us your opinion on the growth that we've seen over the past 20 years. I mean, that's good news for patients, right? And it's good news for innovation because that means we're discovering new drugs and we want to test them, and that's a positive thing. But why is it that we are finding that almost half of these trials that, massive number of trials are targeting cancer?
Sure. So there's obviously been a tremendous amount of scientific advancements over the last 20 years. And I think we understand cancer and the whole world of oncology in so much more of a nuanced way than we understood it 20 years ago, right? It's not just cancer as a bubble anymore. Every disease, every form of cancer is a different disease that we're treating. And so we've had this massive growth in the clinical trial space over the last 20 years. And in order to keep up with it, we've always had to be, focused on the big pharma, the big CROs. But because of that, the patient journey has really lagged behind. And it's created this really big disconnect between the pharma companies and the CROs and the big people in this space and the patients that they desperately need to enroll in these trials. And it's created this almost like behemoth of a problem with recruitment and enrollment in clinical trials. And companies are scrambling to get enough patients in, and patients are scrambling to find the right trials that they think could be, life-saving. They just don't really know how to connect. And it's a struggle.
It's a struggle. I mean, and we noticed this actually during the pandemic. So at least I noticed two different trends that were going on during the pandemic. I mean, it brought a lot of attention to the clinical trials terminology, right? Because so much of it played out, in the public domain, in media. We were all under lockdown and we were watching news, 24/7. But we also saw two things happening. So on the one hand, it seemed like literacy about the terminology and the nomenclature used in clinical trials, people started to get familiar with it. And in fact, starting to get familiar with the statistical significance and, numbers and so on and such forth. However, at the same time, because so much of it played out in the public and people were getting so much information, we saw tons of patient mistrust happening, right? In clinical trial data, because of maybe, health literacy, because of the lack of education on the topic, what do you believe are the problems we have with clinical trials and clinical trials recruitment today?
One being, I think, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right now, pharmaceutical companies really around the world, but especially here in the US, want to get a cross-representation of patients because actually drugs can affect different patients based upon different genetic makeups differently. And so it's really important as you're developing a drug to really bring in an inclusion of people. And that is something that right now is a very important focus of pharmaceutical companies, but isn't really being addressed in terms of a solution.
Why so?
It's just very hard to educate the potential patients, especially across a diverse grouping, to get them to learn. As you mentioned, during the pandemic, I think it was the first time that I have seen in over 20 years in the industry where people started to even understand that there's a clinical trial, where the term clinical trial, and I think the trials run by Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer, Moderna, opened up the eyes to a lot of patients that there is a concept, but there's still a tremendous, really dearth of awareness amongst patients as to potential trials that are available to them. And especially, part of what we're doing in Clinical Trial Guide is to expand it into multiple languages so that the resources available there to people with all backgrounds. And it's just not really, it's a very serious problem that needs a lot of effort. And at Clinical Trial Guide, we're trying to address that head on.
Yeah, and I think because representation matters, I mean, it's the right thing to do, but it's also important because you want to make sure that, the drugs that we are developing can work across a diverse patient population, right? Because they are the customers that we serve. And so if you do clinical trials, in the old days, clinical trials were done just on men, right? Women were not even included. And so the drug may or may not work the same way in women, for example. So similarly, in diverse populations, you have diverse ways that, the drug will work. And so we need all of that data and all of that information to make those decisions. And so, so in your mind, right, that is still a hot topic now. And I think that everybody understands the rationale for increasing diversity in clinical trials. How do we sort of make that shift, though, aside from patient education? What kinds of things can we do in terms of recruiting people into trials, number one? And number two, your website, how does it help the cause?
Sure. So I like to say that there's sort of like 2.5 problems involved with clinical trial recruitment. The first is basic lack of information, like we've been speaking to up until now. The second problem is that once patients have enough information to understand the trial process in general, it is insanely difficult for them to find the right trial for them. So I had this example personally. My mom had asked me to look into a clinical trial for my grandfather, actually, who had cancer at the time. And I spent days, if not weeks, trying to read through the eligibility requirements on a website like clinicaltrials.gov and other websites to see if he would be eligible. I tried contacting the pharmaceutical company. I couldn't reach anybody. And at the end of the day, we decided to give up on the idea of a clinical trial for him because the access was just not available. And so the same thing holds true for like millions of patients actually across America that are trying to find the right trial but cannot find the actual trial that meets their needs because they can't understand all the information that's out there. It's not geared towards the average person. It's really so industry focused. And then within that category, why I like to say it's 2.5 problems is that patients can never actually reach an actual person on the other side at a trial site. I think trial sites are inundated with the amount that they have to do and all the intake, and it's just impossible for them to respond directly to all the patients. And so because of that, patients frequently just give up on the idea of a clinical trial because the access is just not there for them.
That's really interesting because your latest project, what is it called? Trial Connect, right?
Yes.
Why are you calling it that? And you're comparing it to the WebMD or the Airbnb of clinical trials. So tell me a little bit more about that concept and how does that help solve the 2.5 problems that Rivka talked about?
Yeah, so right now, really, patients have to go out there and try to track down a site. What we're going to build out is called Trial Connect. It'll be part of Clinical Trial Guide, which will enable pharmaceutical companies or CROs or clinical trial sites, and we're going to aid in that communications process to communicate directly and to provide the patient the ability to put themselves out there and say, I'm looking for this type of study, and then we'll provide a whole resource of related studies to that patient so that they know what's potentially available to them, as well as aid in directly connecting them to the, again, CRO, if they could be running the study, or direct to a clinical trial site or to a pharmaceutical company, and really focus on building up through multiple strategies and approaches, ways to help patients and a potential clinical trial connect with each other.
That's great. Yeah.
I'll just explain why I call it the Airbnb of trials. So before Airbnb, if you owned a property somewhere out there, right, you had to find somebody to rent your property. But with Airbnb, it allowed me who wants to take a vacation anywhere to find a property. But in turn, that really helped the property owner because he had somebody paying to rent his property. So it's actually really the same thing now. The amount of funds that goes into clinical trial recruitment is astronomical. I think the average cost of recruitment per patient in the US, just for the recruitment, not for the trial itself, is $7,000. And pharma companies are spending...
it costs $7,000 to recruit one patient into a clinical trial, on average.
But it is
it's a costly thing.
Very costly, but it's also not, that's just the average. It is not abnormal for pharma companies to pay $250,000 to recruit a patient for a rare disease study. And so we're flipping that on its head. Right now, pharma companies are trying to get to their patients. We're creating a platform that allows patients to find the pharma companies, find the right trials for them, which obviously, as David mentioned, is beneficial to the patient, but is also extremely beneficial to the pharmaceutical company because they need patients in their trials.
Yeah, because, unless you recruit a certain number of patients into the trial, you can't get the right data, and you need to have enough robust data to get to a result that's statistically significant to either go to the next phase of the trial or to submit, the particular product for approval, right?
Absolutely.
And, it just occurs to me, we've been talking a lot about AI here at Cure, and we've got an ongoing challenge, Health AI for Good. So we're challenging innovators and entrepreneurs to apply AI to solve big problems in the health arena. And it's just occurring to me as we are talking that AI could maybe help. What do you think? What about like language learning models and, large language learning models, other forms of AI that could eliminate the physician burden or the trial recruitment site's burden, right? Because that's why you can get the other person on the other side of the line and also reduce costs, right? I mean, wouldn't that be great?
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts?
We definitely, the AI is certainly, although it's exploded over the last year or two and it's in the news daily, it's still really a nascent industry. And we have started to look into just beginning to integrate AI in terms of helping to translate a lot of the complex terms around trials to immediately enable potential patients in these studies or patients who are seeking a study to be able to better understand what the study is about. So we're already looking into integrating the AI at the beginning level in terms of translation and in terms of being able to communicate effectively more about the trial to the patient base. But we certainly believe that there is potential to further integrate AI and definitely in the early stages of exploring what that could be. But already at this point in time, we've already experimented in terms of integrating it to a really like a translating tool for very complicated, complex biotech or pharmaceutical terms and turning them into plain English explanations, or complicated pharmaceutical clinical trial terms and turning them into really easier to understand language.
Rivka?
I echo what David said. I definitely think that there is a tremendous opportunity with AI. I do want to caution, though, that we did a tremendous amount of research into this space, and so many patients and caregivers or family members told us that one of the largest hindrances to their clinical trial enrollment was simply not being able to reach another person, right? That point of contact of a real person at the other end of the line removes so many barriers. So I think we definitely will be incorporating AI, but we need to be cautious about it to make sure that it doesn't completely remove the human element of it.
Yes, absolutely. A human needs to be involved, but some of the administrative tasks that's preventing the human being on the other end from picking up the phone, AI can take care of.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Freeing up that human to pick up the phone and talk to the patient,
Yes,
right?
definitely.
That's what, an ideal world looks like. Well, I want to say, thank you for joining us. Good luck to both of you, David and Rivka. Good luck with your upcoming launch of this brand new site, and for, dedicating your lives to educating patients and also partnering with industry as well as government on making clinical trials, more accessible in terms of learning more about them, but also democratizing access to trials. So thank you so much for joining us on
Thank you
Tuesday
for
Talks.
having us
and thank you for everything Cure does. It's really amazing to be here.
Thank you. Don't forget to tune in every Tuesday for important conversations with the top healthcare leaders and entrepreneurs who are advancing healthcare and driving cures, period.